Well, good morning or good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and we're very happy to welcome you all this afternoon or morning to a conversation about a very important set of summits here in Brussels and a very important trip by President Biden, who left today to fly to Brussels for 3 different summits here in Brussels, G7, a meeting with the European Union, and also an extraordinary summit at NATO. And then he's going to go on to Poland. And, you know, this trip comes at a time of arguably the most serious security crisis in Europe since 1945, and an extraordinary moment for the alliance, for the EU, for multiple stakeholders in Europe, and also for US foreign and security policy. We're really delighted to have with us today my 3 wonderful colleagues, actually, who will give us different perspectives on the visit as they see it. And let me just introduce them to you. We're happy to have Alexandra de Scheffer, who is the director of the GMF office in Paris and also leads our research on security and defense. We also have with us from Warsaw, Michal Baranowski, who is the director of our office there, and my colleague, Keil, fellow at GMF in Washington, working on security and defense. So 3, terrific people to give us different perspectives on the trip, what we could expect, what might surprise us, what next? Many things to talk about. Michal, you're closest to the war. Maybe we could go to you first to share with us some perspectives, expectations. What is Warsaw looking to see from this visit by President Biden? How do you see it?
Thank you, Ian, and it's great to be both with Alexandra and Steve and everyone online. Yeah, welcome from Warsaw. We were just comparing notes on how close we are all to Ukraine, and it's certainly here in Warsaw we are feeling the war. Although of course it's our Ukrainians brothers and sisters, our friends who are really suffering and are fighting in this brutal war. It is very good to see that President Biden is coming again to Europe. This is his 3rd visit. He hasn't visited any place else as frequently as Europe. So the political signal of this visit is an important one, and the unity of West that US has built over the past months is very exemplary, and in some ways perhaps for us even a little bit surprising in a positive way. But Ian, if you ask, besides this important political message, what else do we expect? And there are pretty high expectations, especially that, as you mentioned, President Biden will be coming to Warsaw. And interestingly, too, an interesting little tidbit, Warsaw is, I think, the only place that was visited by all 4 key US national security officials, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Vice President 2 weeks ago, and on Friday and Saturday, President of the United States, which shows you where the geopolitical tensions in the world really are right now. Okay, so what do we want? What do we think should happen? First, US needs to speed up the delivery of weapons to Ukraine. This is what the real frontline state between autocracies and democracies are. This is the main theme of President Biden. It was sort of a more metaphorical tension or battle in the past, and now we have a real front. So US needs to continue to do everything it can to support Ukraine, and that means delivering this 800 million of military aid as fast as possible. And we need to also put away this distinction between offensive and defensive weapons. In case of Ukraine, this really just is all defensive because it's Russia who attacked Ukraine. So weapons to Ukraine. Secondly, more air and missile defense to the eastern flank, especially to Poland and Romania. We have the longest borders with Ukraine, and the missile attack just a week and a half ago by Russia that attacked a base only 20 kilometers from the Polish border is a sign that this war could, on purpose or by mistake, escalate into Article 5 territory. We need to put more missile defense on our borders. By the way, fun fact, if we put them close enough, they actually can provide some of the cover for Ukraine as well. Ukraine's missiles, we can discuss that a little bit. Third, we need to beef up quickly the NATO's presence on the eastern flank. Secretary General already highlighted it today. There will be 4 additional battle groups going to southeastern part of the alliance, matching the NATO's presence on the northeastern flank. But frankly, the 4th and most important point, longer term, is that we really need to wake up to the new reality of confrontation with Russia, recognize that this is going to be a long-term confrontation that needs to be matched by a different posture of NATO, and we need to move from what we had so far with these battle groups, which was deterrence by presence, to forward defense, in many ways much more similar to what NATO had during the Cold War, though not necessarily the same numbers, but basically have sufficient forces in the east to defend in case Russia decides to do something even more crazy, and in recognition that their forces have been, with the especially disappearance of Belarus, have been much more dominant in this region. Ian, let me stop here.
Michal, thank you very much. And let me also mention, before I turn to Alexandra, mention to all of you that you can put questions in the Q&A function, and we will absolutely get to those after we have our conversation here. But Alexandra, let me turn to you. Michal started to talk a little bit about this, well, the symbolism of the visit, but also, some of the deliverables that people are expecting. And deliverables also come with risks. And the view about that equation between what's desirable and what's risky tends to differ a bit where you go in the alliance. How is the scene from Paris? What, from your perspective, or from your perspective in Paris, what are you expecting? To what extent will there be hard deliverables in the security area? We could also talk about the sanctions, which we haven't done yet too. Yeah, absolutely. But Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you, and very happy to be on this virtual panel with my colleagues Michal and Stephen. Here, obviously, I think we all share that this Russian invasion of Ukraine marks the beginning of a new era in Europe. Obviously, Europeans are being forced to rethink their defense posture, as well as the security order on the European continent. And this obviously significantly impacts how we approach our alliances. How do we operate within NATO? How do we operate within the EU framework and other frameworks? And it also entails that we need to look at the Russia-China's strategic partnership in a very different way. It's going to be very important to watch how this partnership is developing and accelerating in this Ukraine-Russia conflict. So this is really in terms of the context, and it's true that France has been, impulsing this type of reflection for a few years now, trying to, keep the dialogue channel open with Putin. Obviously, it has failed, but France has also learned from these failures. Has also, since 2016, reinvested into NATO and stepped up this role in the NATO so-called reassurance missions on the eastern flank in Estonia, but also in Romania more recently. So this war is really accelerating Europe's awakening to what I would call the real threat posed by Russia. And this threat has been long identified by countries like Poland. Michal has stated it very clearly, by our colleagues in the Baltic states. Russia has always been portrayed by these countries as a major threat to European stability, and countries like France, have probably underestimated that perception coming from the eastern flank, focusing more on our geographical south and gambling on what I would call a sort of reset of Europeans' relationship with Russia. Germany has focused on its economic, energy relationship with Russia. And Ian, you mentioned the sanction dimension. It seems that the EU has pretty much reached the limit of what it can actually do, because if we really wanted to act seriously and cause pain to Russia, it would obviously be a question of limiting our imports of gas and oil. And this is something that countries, like Germany said they cannot do, Italy and other countries as well. So this war in Ukraine also, I would say, reveals the strategic cost of our economic energy dependence vis-a-vis Russia, to the same extent that the COVID-19 crisis revealed the strategic geopolitical cost of our dependencies vis-a-vis China. So we need to accelerate. I fully agree with what Michal said. I think we all share the same assessment. We all share and we all agree that there is no return to the status quo, to the pre-February 24, the day when Russia invaded Ukraine. And I agree with Michal as well that we have entered an era of sustained confrontation with Russia. This is just a new reality. So today, I think, this NATO extraordinary summit is taking place in a tipping point phase of this conflict. In France, we would call it un moment de bascule, because Russia's military forces are clearly encountering difficulties on the ground. Ukraine is desperately needing much more help, especially in terms of arms delivery, but not only. And so we need to accelerate our support before it's too late, right? It's not a question of months or weeks, it's a question of days. And so tomorrow, the expectation, and I think the expectation of Western public opinion is to see strong decision. One advice I would give, I hope it's not too late, it would be to hear the NATO Secretary General, to hear President Biden and other European leaders saying what they are going to do and stop saying what they're not willing to do. That already would be a tremendous change in the narrative or in the strategic communication of the alliance, and it would have a much more effective deterrent effect. We need to invert the deterrence in this crisis. We are currently being deterred by Putin, and we need to tip this balance. The other thing, fully agree with Michal as well, we need to erase all of these artificial conceptual distinctions that we have been putting very and too loudly out there: defensive, offensive, be careful, we're going to become co-belligerents. This is all nice for a PhD dissertation, but I think we are not in a philosophical or international relations debate. We are in the emergency phase right now, and we need to start developing these tools. So the announcement that the NATO Secretary General has been putting just a few hours ago are clearly important signals of reinforcing the eastern flank of the alliance. We also see once again, and we'll hear Stephen right after that, when the United States steps up, and this is what Biden has been doing under the pressure of the American Congress, the rest of the alliance steps up. And so this shows again how significant US leadership is within this alliance, how the US policeman, if I can say, is still playing a significant role in Europe's security. We might regret that to a certain extent, because it would be a moment for Europeans actually to act as a more strategic security defense player. And we've seen, you know, at the EU Summit in Versailles, that President Macron has been hosting a series of decisions that have been taken, but the results will not happen today or tomorrow. They will only really be delivered in the years to come. Last thing I wanted to put out there, I know this will be part of the NATO EU conversations. We cannot just focus on Ukraine. We need to focus on, have a regional approach. I know that Bosnia will be discussed as well. The Balkans will be discussed as well, because there is a clear concern of a potential domino effect or spillover into the Balkan region, which is, you know, in between, if I can say, the Russian influence, the West, and let's not forget the Chinese influence as well. And this is typically an example of a region on the European continent that the EU, to a certain extent, the US, NATO has neglected this few couple of years, have left it open to Russian and Chinese influence, and that obviously we need to reinvest. And lastly, on Bosnia in particular, you might have seen that the EU has reinforced the so-called EU4 peace mission there by doubling the number of soldiers from 500 to a bit more to 1,000. This is probably not sufficient. Kosovo, Pristina has been asking for more US military presence, for an acceleration of the candidacy to NATO. So you see a lot of movement in that region as well. And this is typically a region that we should be paying much more attention to. Thank you very much.
Alexandra, thank you very much. And you know, you put, you know, in a way, very, actually both you and Michal have spoken in a very articulate way about what you feel is needed, which is an important part of the question here. There's also a question about what can be done, who can do it. It's in a way easier to answer those questions in terms of defending NATO territory than it is to talk about what's implied by doing more for Ukraine directly. But clearly that's going to be a lot of what is demanded from leaders at this set of summits over the next days. You know, what can, in that sense, what can Biden bring? What will he ask for? You know, who will be disappointed if inevitably there will be people disappointed? But we can continue our conversation to think about, you know, Stephen, tell us, what will Biden bring with him? What will he ask for? Beyond the symbolic, which is obviously very, very important, as all of us have underscored. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Alexandra and Michal. Well, I wouldn't necessarily diminish the political symbolism and what it means. It's very intentional. It's very intentional to signal not just to NATO allies solidarity, the presence of the United States president in Europe right now, and also specifically visiting Poland, which again, missile only fell 15 miles from Poland's border not that long ago. This is all very intentional. It's about reassuring allies about the US commitment to the alliance and underscoring Article 5. It's also signaling to Putin. It's trying to signal that, as I think both the Secretary General and President Biden have been very clear, that they may not be intending to engage in Ukrainian conflict in any real way, but clearly, if Russia were to miscalculate, to push the boundaries, to push into NATO territory, it would be met with a firm response. And I think that is another part of the signal that is being sent now. And it'll be part of what we see coming out of the summit as well, that very clear language. So I guess I would just start saying that the political elements are probably actually the most foremost important elements of the visit right now. But clearly, the alliance is seeking to do more, to support Ukraine, not just support NATO allies. And that will be part of the conversation. Clearly, this morning, the Secretary General announced, and actually Ambassador Smith also had a conversation earlier today that illuminated a little bit of what will be happening, that NATO will be seeking to provide additional military and humanitarian assistance, or NATO nations will be seeking to provide additional humanitarian military assistance to Ukraine. And this actually will likely include CBRN aid, essentially in case and out of the fear that any kind of chemical or biological or nuclear attack may happen in Ukraine. NATO nations are trying to help Ukraine prepare for what would be an absolutely catastrophic development. And I think to this point, and I wanted to address something Alexandra said, and that is talking more about what we are willing to do and not necessarily talking about what we're not willing to do. I will say that the Secretary General's remarks today at his press conference, when it talked about the use of chemical weapons, it was very ambiguous. It didn't rule anything out. I do think that in that sense, they are trying to create an atmosphere that there are things that would fundamentally change the risk calculus, that would change the nature of the conflict. And while they're not at all saying what that may ultimately lead to, they are not being as clear about what they are ruling out, especially when it relates to these kinds of threats. So I did just want to offer that. And then maybe one last point I think that is interesting is that, and Alexandra alluded to this, it's the importance of American leadership. And I found it very interesting that actually as the invasion moved forward and the conflict developed, there was actually a little bit of a decision, I think an intentional one for the United States to step back a little bit and allow European allies and partners to lead on certain sanctions efforts, to lead on some of the political developments. And this is when we saw these huge policy shifts from Germany, Denmark, Sweden, all these other countries that were making these big decisions. But I do think that this trip, in short, is trying to again demonstrate that the US political commitment is here to stay, and that in a lot of ways, I think it will be shaping the conversation that we're seeing over the next few days. It will be highly involved and highly engaged. I do think that there will be other deliverables that come out of the summit that are important for us to think about and maybe talk about more in detail. We did talk about the enhanced forward presence and the augmenting of forces in Southeastern Europe. But the decision will be taken tomorrow as well to determine kind of what the new force posture may look like, tasking generals, tasking military leaders to determine what the new force posture will look like more permanently, and to start looking toward Madrid, the strategic concept, and something that will be absolutely fundamentally shifting the way that NATO is postured and the way that a lot of allies and partners are thinking about European security. So there are definitely some tangible things that I think the Biden team is looking for out of this visit. But again, returning to my first point, I think the political support, that element of it is just an absolutely crucial piece. And it comes at a crucial time in the conflict, as Ukraine does seem to be beating back Russian forces in significant ways, but also as a lot of allies and partners just are very insecure in this moment, as potential for escalation, for miscalculation or spillover is a really serious consideration.
Stephen, thanks very much. And you know, you're sitting in Washington, so you know, forgive me if I ask you what the politics of this trip for Biden in Washington, well, in the United States. Just say a little bit about that. He's coming out of a very polarized political environment. How is this being discussed in those circles in Washington, on the Hill and elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that if anything, what Putin has managed to do and what this invasion has done is actually created a lot of uniformity on the fact that the US needs to be active in supporting allies and partners. Of course, there are some differences on specific measures, but there actually seems to be a consolidated position around the more controversial ones, like a no-fly zone. You actually don't see too many folks at this point kind of stepping out and trying to push the administration far beyond what they're already willing to say that they're going to do or willing to do. I'm not saying that that doesn't exist, but I would not say, I'd say that's more the exception than the rule here. And it's actually solidified it. If you look polling across the United States, this has really seeped into a broader national consciousness, and the support for Ukraine is pretty astounding throughout the country. And that will have an effect as we move to the midterm elections this year. We don't really know what, but we can already see, I think, that some of the more extreme parts of the political spectrum particularly in the Republican Party that was maybe more America first or had kind of more a Trumpian bent, is trying to change their narrative, including Trump himself, who tried to take credit for being able to support Ukraine and basically saying that NATO wouldn't exist today if it weren't for him. So you see that there's just this kind of reshuffling around some of these issues. And so I think that the domestic support in the United States will only push Congress and the administration to do more. I don't really see anyone getting too far out ahead of anyone. I mean, we talk about, medium range air defense systems, particularly the old Soviet type. But again, this is more of a consensus position. I see the administration actually trying to find ways to do this. I mean, the Hill seems to be outspoken on it, but it's not that the administration is shuttering these things. Questions around MiGs transfers are more complicated, and perhaps Michal might want to chime in here. But again, I would say that it's actually been a profound transformation and kind of more uniformity in politics than what we've seen recently.
Stephen, thank you. I wanted to, and just to say, I'm aware that Alexandra, this is a very busy week for people watching these issues in Washington and in Europe. And so she has to actually depart for something quite important in a little bit. So I just did want to make sure we had a bit of a conversation with you, Alexandra, before you have to do that. You know, this question of what are the risks in this trip? I mean, is the major risk simply that the gap between what publics, what leaders in some capitals expect and what leaders are able to deliver collectively is simply growing in a way that is not sustainable? It may be sustainable on the side of NATO strategy, defending NATO territory and new changes to force posture and strategy and so forth. But when it comes to doing more for Ukraine, this gets much tougher, especially if NATO is the actor and not just individual countries. I'd like to have your thoughts on that, Alexandra, but also from you too, Michal, from your perspective in Warsaw. But Alexandra, please, over to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, this NATO summit was qualified as an extraordinary summit. So there are a lot of expectations. You know, when you call a summit extraordinary, you obviously expect extraordinary outcomes. What we're going to see is definitely, as you know, the NATO SecGen has just said 2 or 3 hours ago, a reinforcement of this so-called NATO's forward presence on the eastern flank. That's for sure, and that is, I would say, the result also of a strong consensus among the NATO member allies. There's also going to be some reinvestment, as I said, in the Balkan region. That also, from an EU and NATO perspective, is strongly shared. Then, as you just said, Ian, when it comes to deciding how to get more directly involved with Ukraine, this is where it becomes trickier. And this, in fact, is where you don't have a NATO response, but you have a member state's response. And the transfer, the decision of transferring military equipment, anti-tank, anti-aerial missiles, all of that is a member state decision. What is interesting on the EU side is that for the first time, the EU has decided to use tools that it had, started to implement 1 year ago or 2 years ago. I'm talking of the EU Facility for Peace, which finally is going to have its first utility and implementation in this context, 1 billion euros that will actually serve to transfer arms to Ukraine directly. So there are some concrete decisions that have an immediate effect. But then once again, and I read Tracy Wilkinson a question here from the Los Angeles Times asking, isn't there a contradiction between saying that more needs to be done for Ukraine, a matter of days, not weeks, but then the EU at least has already done as much as it can in terms of the sanctions mostly. Of course, there is a contradiction, but it's about articulating what we can do now and what we need to do in the middle and longer term. And there you have a NATO longer term strategy that will start to be discussed tomorrow at the NATO Summit. How does NATO need to rethink its position on the eastern flank of the alliance and more broadly on the European continent? And for the EU, it's very much about rethinking our energy dependence or energy independence from Russian gas. And obviously these issues will take much more time to implement.
Sorry, Alexandra, thank you. Michal, over to you on that question, but also, maybe more specifically, what are the Polish asks Biden here that you could imagine?
Well, this is, Alexandra mentioned that this is an extraordinary summit, but from our perspective, this is a war summit, right? This is not just something to, the leaders will be expected to act and both in the long term, but also very much in the short term. And it's good news, definitely, that we'll see the 4 battle groups move to southeastern edge of the alliance, southeastern flank of the alliance. They will match what we have in the northeastern flank of the alliance, but we have to remember that this is 1,000-strong soldiers battle groups, right? Yes, we have more US forces here. They are now 10,000 forces, 10,000 US forces in Poland alone. But if I look around on my map, or smaller map of Poland, to the north, I have Kaliningrad with more tanks than Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany combined, and 30,000 Russian soldiers. To the east, I have Belarus that in military terms ceased to exist and has substantial Russian soldiers, 30,000 plus, and increasingly permanent bases, Russian bases. And there is a border with Ukraine that is at war and that experienced shelling nearby. So all this points me as sitting in Warsaw that we need to change the force structure of the alliance and be quick and serious about this. It's a long way of answering, Ian, that the main ask is figure out how to help Ukraine as effectively, because that's where the front line is right now, but at the same time move the alliance to forward defense with forces that are, again, basically that follow the military advice of alliances generals, and will be much more in the much closer to 90,000 than to 10,000 what we have right now. It's just that's the main ask that we'll see. There's also one, well, let me stop here. There's a question of a peacekeeping mission, but I'm not sure. I think the rest of the alliance wants to see the details from the Polish side, and I hope that they'll be provided in details to see what exactly that would mean without unnecessarily escalating the situation there. Thanks.
Michal, thank you very much indeed. And I know you've been reading the questions that have come in the Q&A. Please do put more in there if you'd like. There are a number of questions about Turkey. We can get to those. There is a number of questions that in some ways relate to the next steps in this war. We're obviously, this set of summits is taking place in an extraordinary way at a time of war, as you say. But allies are also beginning to think about what comes after. I mean, Alexandra, you alluded to this in terms of the, how do we manage this greatly deteriorated relationship, an unstable relationship with Moscow, in fact, over a wider geography. And you could even go wider than you mentioned, into the Sahel and other places where North Africa, where Russia and the West come into contact with one another. But I don't know if any of you would like to weigh in on the question on Turkey and whether Turkey is likely to do enough. It's something I follow. I'm happy to offer something, but he's pointing at me. All right, I'm going to offer something about it. I think this is a hugely difficult situation for Turkey. Turkey is a huge stakeholder in this by virtue of geography and its commercial relationship with Russia and many other things, an arms relationship with both Ukraine and Russia. Turkey is extremely exposed. On the other hand, and Turkey has a lot of capacity in this regard, especially around the Black Sea. It has to be an integral part of what NATO does in terms of its force posture in the future. I think this is going to, over the long term, I think this is going to pull Turkey back towards a closer relationship with NATO and the United States, but it's still not going to be easy. And one of the points where it's going to be very difficult, I think, is on sanctions. Because I think Ankara is historically allergic to sanctions, is under sanctions itself, in fact. May look to get out of some of them, but it's going to be very hard. And this goes to some of the politics on Capitol Hill, Stephen. It's going to be very hard, I think, for Turkey to make a lot of headway in areas where they would like to on sanctions, coming back into the F-35 program and other things, if they're not seen to be implementing sanctions against Russia. And this is going to be very tough for Turkey to do. And they may even be seen as helping Russia circumvent the sanctions. And that's going to be a big risk. I think it's going to be very hard to make progress in areas where Turkey would like it if that sanctions issue is still open, seen negatively, in fact, in Washington. And that, I think, will be almost as true in Brussels. But anyway, I've now given a long answer to a number of short questions about Turkey, but I'm happy if anyone else would like to weigh in. There are clearly different perspectives on this in Paris and in Washington.
I'd be happy to just very briefly. I mean, Turkey obviously, has been playing an important role in providing these drones to the Ukrainian army that have proven to be extremely efficient. But apart from that, I think what's really interesting is that Zelensky has reached out several times to Turkey as a mediating player in that crisis. So Turkey has hosted several of these Ukraine-Russia negotiations, done the same with Israel. So what you're kind of seeing is also a form of de-Westernization of what we could call crisis diplomacy. And there's a lot of discussion in terms of the security guarantees that could be provided to Ukraine in the case Ukraine find a compromise. Obviously, we will need to guarantee the final result of that compromise, and Turkey is part of these potential guarantors, if I can say, that Ukraine is looking to. So Turkey will play an important role in both the political, military assistance, and I would say the final agreement, if a final agreement is being reached. But I fully agree with Ian that this will probably push Turkey to, if I can use that term, to repivot to NATO and use its mediating position, or at least what it portrays as a mediating position, to do that.
Yeah, Stephen, how do you see that? I mean, just looking at the politics on Capitol Hill, is this an opportunity for Turkish-U.S. relations over this, or is it going to be held up over the sanctions issue, and Turkey simply not doing what allies might expect when it comes to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if Turkey is, as you kind of said, seen to be helping Russian circumvent sanctions, it's going to be, I think, a huge problem. And it unfortunately probably is compounded by a narrative on Capitol Hill about Turkey and about the relationship with Turkey over the last several years. So to escape that, I mean, I think Turkey, it absolutely is an opportunity, but I think it's going to take a very intentional movement from Turkey to demonstrate some goodwill to Washington specifically, but the alliance in Ukraine more broadly. I mean, there's this issue of the S-400s that's still hanging out there. and I know people aren't wanting to talk about it, but it is still there. So I don't know. I mean, Ian, you would know this better than me. I don't know how easily this conversation, goes away, but it still is there, and it's kind of central to a lot of the criticisms that had been lobbed at Turkey over the last several years.
Well, I mean, Michal, go ahead.
Just an interesting piece that I'm not sure if everyone is aware in Western Europe or in the United States of I just want to point out the growing relationship also between Poland and Turkey, and it's been going on for a while, but very recently, it's now that the days seem to be mixing for all of us, but it was, I think, just last week, President Duda visited Ankara, and in Poland there is quite a bit of focus on this role that Turkey could play in either mediating, softening the conflict, and of course providing the drones, which are doing so very well against Russian armor. So there is this growing relationship, despite quite a few hang-ups, especially before the war, about Turkey's close relationship or relationship with Russia.
There are a number of different questions that, and you forgive me if I group them a little bit, that relate to the question of public opinion, both in Russia and in the West, and the question of narratives and this battle of narratives. Is there the potential, do you think, from this set of meetings for a different set of narratives to emerge that perhaps are more potent in terms of their effect in Russia, their effect on opinion in the West? How do you see that opinion shaping moment? Alexandra, maybe to you, because I know you have to leave.
No, absolutely. I mean, I truly believe in the influence and impact of public opinions in terms of political strategic decision making. We see that there is both in the US and Europe and elsewhere, a lot of frustration and interrogations coming from Western, I don't like the term Western, but let's simplify, public opinions wondering why NATO is not getting more directly involved, why is Biden taking a more or less prudent approach. I see a question as well, what's the difference between delivering the famous MiG aircraft and delivering drones or defensive weapons? So there are a lot of questions of maybe what can be perceived as a default of courage, political courage in that particular crisis, using what can be perceived as a pretext that Ukraine is neither a member of NATO, neither a member of the EU, so let's not get directly involved. And I think it's the whole narrative that I was saying at the beginning, where the NATO SecGen, Biden, and a lot of European decision makers have been saying too much too out loud what they didn't want to do, putting their own red lines out there, and not what they were going to do in the weeks and days to come. So I really hope that there's going to be this clarification at the NATO summit, the EU summit as well. But that, I think, is an expectation, coming from public opinions who are wondering, why do we impose on ourselves these limits and these red lines to what we could do, and why can we not go through intermediary or other actions without going too much, escalating the tensions with Russia directly. So I would say this is pretty much what people are expecting, and this summit should be a summit of clarification.
Alexandra, thank you very much. Stephen, maybe to you, I mean, from an American perspective, the war of narratives here and the opportunity that the set of summits provide, how do you see it?
Well, I mean, I think as far as the broader narrative in the United States, I mean, I already alluded to it earlier that I do think anecdotally from what I've seen, there's just this very high awareness of what is happening in Ukraine across the United States, and it's impacting the way that we see it politically. And I think that is just very true, whether or not what happens this week really shapes or contributes to that. I'm not entirely sure, but clearly there is just this at least broader consciousness of what is happening, I think, in Eastern Europe right now. Maybe just on Alexandra's point on escalation and the narrative around escalation, I don't think this is a public opinion kind of question. This is definitely a policymaker, policy community conversation. And I do think like there's a lot to be said about the unpredictability of the Putin regime. And this is the thing we're all trying to grapple with. I would say actually not just most analysts, but most intelligence services wrongly predicted what Ukraine was, or what Russia was willing to do in and around Ukraine. So there's a whole dose of humility that I think all of us are trying to have when we're understanding the limits of what Putin is willing to do. I heard so many folks say like this action is irrational or it doesn't make sense. But clearly the calculus that Putin was using was just a very different one than the one that we were applying to him and what he was willing to do in the region. Now, I think definitely some of our allies and partners understood that narrative quite well, and both, I think, British and US intelligence understood the picture well. But now when we're talking about what are the next steps that we take and what escalatory consequences will they have, we're trying to understand we're operating within this very difficult paradigm, and that escalation it's a real consideration. And this is why I feel like every speech section, the NATO Secretary General, and every speech that President Biden has given has been, we do not want to see a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. And that has an impact on the broader narrative. And then maybe just one last point on the narrative in Russia. Unfortunately, we're very limited on our impact on the narrative in Russia, right? I mean, everything that Putin has been able to do he's been doing this over years, but the way that he's clamped down over the past several weeks is just shut a lot of Russia off from any outside conversation. And this is really challenging our ability to help the narrative there at all. Now, clearly there are some folks that are doing great work on this and trying to get information into Russia, but there's a fundamental problem with understanding how that narrative is changing in Russia, because our ability to see it is just not what it was previously.
Stephen, thanks. Michal, the narrative piece of this, and it's a funny question, I suppose, to answer from a place that is sort of in a way very near the front line, right? I mean, you could sort of say, well, all right, narratives, it's all fine, this is a war. But anyway, on that question,
no, it's true that planes and tanks seem a little bit more important than words right now. But let me take a shot at this, because I actually think that there is a real opportunity here, perhaps even especially in Warsaw, for President Biden to provide a more positive, forward-leaning vision of the situation after war, post-war. I mean, both we are, of course, during the war, but for point number one, I would be surprised if he doesn't make this point, is that for President Biden, the competition or confrontation between democracies and autocracies is the central issue in his presidency. And of course, it was this sort of imaginary or sort of not imaginary, but not a concrete competition. And now we have a concrete front line between democracy on one hand and autocracy that is attacking it on the other. So I think we can see it, and we can see what this battle is about. That's one thing. And I think the second is perhaps also the narrative of the brighter future, because I think here I'm sure we are worried very much, but I think it's true both across the Europe and across the world, that we are worried about what whether this turns into World War III or whether it turns into sort of Cold War. The Cold War is almost a best case scenario. So it's a question about this long-term confrontation and competition, and also a hope for Ukraine. And this is where, being from the German Marshall Fund of the United States, this idea, of course, of putting forward the vision of the Marshall Plan for Ukraine after the war is done, I think would be very, very appropriate. So I think there are really good opportunities for beginning to shape the post-immediate war narrative, and also, keeping the democratic West focused and united in this moment of struggle.
Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if I can just jump in there too. I mean, I think one of the challenges of the narrative in the United States will again be the midterm elections. And this is where the narrative will play an important part as Biden carries it forward. So as Michal was talking, like, I thought this is exactly kind of some of the narrative that needs to be more pronounced, I think, in US conversations, what ultimately the point is and what the risk is, and where we see the resolution and why we are doing it. I think that the shock of the war and everything we're seeing is the thing that's created this kind of immediate consolidation around supporting Ukraine and the alliance. But as we move to the fall, and as energy prices go up, and as a lot of other divisions, I think, within the United States are likely to appear, this narrative, I think, that Michal is talking about will become more and more important. It will be more about what we are trying to do, what we're trying to shape, and why we're trying to do it, why it matters.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm conscious of our time, but I did want to come back to you both with a fascinating, I think, but also maybe an impossible question, but you'll forgive me for that. What could surprise us this week? And, surprise us in terms of what Biden might bring or might be asked, or what others might bring to the table, but also possibly what Putin might decide to do this week when the spotlight is on this war. Michal, go ahead, tell us.
Well, Putin, unfortunately, there are a couple very, we are worried of a couple very bad scenarios that Putin can put forward that would be surprising, not surprising, and that's of course the usage of chemical and biological weapon, which would be tragic, but it's not, unfortunately, it seems sort of more probable than not as the war is stalling. So I don't know if it meets the question of surprises. It would be also incredibly damaging, not only to Ukraine, but also well, it would be helpful for Western unity. Let me put it this way. The surprise, I think, and we haven't figured that out perhaps I'm not expecting this. Therefore, it would be surprised that NATO decides to do in fact something that does cross somewhat the red line between Article 5 and non-Article 5 territory. We are inching closer and closer. We are being pushed by the Russian war crimes in Ukraine to this. We are, President Zelensky and other Ukrainian leaders are calling to our both interest and to our moral obligations to do that. So the pressure is very much on, and that's where this idea that was put forward, and I think will be formally put forward, of a peacekeeping mission comes in. Again, this is, I would be surprised if the alliance adopts this, but another idea of an idea would be that we actually consider putting some of the missile defense systems close enough to the Ukrainian border that they can provide a level of protection over Ukraine when it comes to at least missiles. I'm not sure if shooting missiles, Russian missiles heading to Kiev, would be perceived by allies as escalatory, as certainly less escalatory than shooting Russian planes from the sky. And Patriot missile, the fun fact is that Patriot missile put on the Polish-Ukrainian border on the Polish side can cover Lviv. So, you know, maybe something along these lines would be a pretty big surprise.
Yeah, one could also imagine, I suppose, Putin's calculus that maybe this is the week to back off just slightly, so that these cleavages, which do exist at a certain level in terms of sanctions policy and other things on the Western side, become more evident. But we'll have to see. But that too would be a cynical tactic, obviously. Stephen, what could surprise us?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to agree with a lot of what Michal said. Unfortunately, I don't intend to be surprised. I don't think that the US and NATO side of this has been to create much surprise. I think it's been very deliberate and intentional, and I imagine it to remain that way because of the escalatory risks that clearly they're thinking about. Now, I would be surprised if somehow the MiG situation was resolved, and that actually did happen. That is a plausible surprise, although maybe a far-fetched one. Given some of the things we've heard from problems with logistics from the White House on doing something like that. I do think, unfortunately, some of the potential surprises are probably either, like you said, Ian, maybe backing off and allowing things to just play out within the transatlantic relationship, or the opposite of really ratcheting up the brutality and using some really terrible weapons from Putin. Let me clarify, Russia in Ukraine. I think that would be not a surprise, but a terrible tragedy that could happen. Clearly, the president, when he got on his helicopter to leave for Europe, said as much. He said that the risk of the use of chemical weapons in Ukraine is significant. And these are some of the things that, not surprise is not the right word, but I really do think that they would probably change the way we think about this conflict. And the Secretary General said as much earlier today. But as far as what NATO is willing to do at this moment, I don't think surprise is really the order of the day. I think it's more being deliberate.
Okay, thank you. Very small question to you, very briefly, Michal, to end. Any chance the president takes a side trip across the border?
No, I don't think across that, but I do think that he might get very close to a beautiful city of Rzeszów, for those who want to try to pronounce it. This is where the 82nd Brigade is located. This is where a lot of refugees are located. It would be wonderful, given the recent visit of the 4 prime ministers to Kiev, but I think that would be perhaps for now a step too far.
We're going to have to leave it there, but huge thanks to you, Michal, and to you, Stephen, and to Alexandra in absentia. And also, if you'll allow me to thank my colleague, William Stewart Wood, for putting all this together and making it happen electronically today. Great thanks to him. Thanks to all of you who've joined us. It's been an extraordinary conversation, and I'm afraid unlikely to be the last one around this theme. So I wish you all a very good afternoon or evening. Thanks.
Thank you. It was wonderful to be with you.
Good to be with you.